Welcome back to The Crown, Week 2. We learned all about Samuel's beginnings last week. Today we're going to look at chapters 4 to 7 as we continue to move through this book. We're not going to read every verse, but we're going to just kind of carry the storyline through and draw out some lessons. And today we're going to be talking all about the Ark of the Covenant. Now, for many people, the only exposure that they've had to this thing called the Ark of the Covenant, this holy container, is what maybe they saw in an Indiana Jones movie. Remember from Raiders of the Lost Ark, when they open up this container, this Ark of the Covenant, and everybody's faces melt? Well, maybe that was a childhood memory for you, maybe one that disturbed you a little bit. But it's all to say that what we see today in the passage kind of goes along with the fact that there was some real power connected to this Ark of the Covenant. The things that we saw in that Indiana Jones movie, surprisingly, they're not completely unfounded. And so we're going to look at this amazing container today. And 1 Samuel chapters 4 to 7 are going to give us some pretty interesting and sometimes shocking stories as it relates to that. What I want to do today is to quickly summarize the storylines of chapters 4 to 7. And then I want to get to the big point that they're trying to make, because there's actually one big point that chapters 4 to 7 are really making today. And then after we identify that one big point, we're going to get a number of different lessons that flow out of that. So let's dig right in, starting with chapter 4. The Philistines capture the ark. Pastor Mitch just read this passage for us, so we don't need to read it again. But you heard the story. Let me recap. Israel goes out to fight against the Philistines, and they camped in the northeast corner of Philistia. I'm going to show you a map here today so you can kind of follow along. They camped out here in Ebenezer, right on the border of Philistia. And they faced off against the Philistines, but they lost in this battle. They lost 4,000 men, and so they returned to their camp defeated. The elders cannot figure out why God would allow Israel's enemies to defeat them in such a way, and so they decide, sort of on a whim, to have the Ark of the Lord's Covenant brought from Shiloh. And we've had exposure already to Shiloh, where the sort of semi-permanent temple structure was at this time. And so the Ark of the Lord arrives, and the soldiers all cheer so loudly as the Ark arrives, so loudly that the ground is shaking. And the Philistines can actually hear the uproar and feel the ground shaking as they cheer as this Ark is brought. They knew that Yahweh was powerful. These Philistines did. They knew the story of the Egyptians and how God had struck the Egyptians with plagues. But instead of cowering, the Philistines decide, you know what, guys, we need to really fight hard. And so they double down and they fight for their lives. Israel ends up losing 30,000 foot soldiers that day. Eli's 2 sons die as well, as was prophesied, you'll remember from last week. But the biggest storyline in everything that takes place is that the Ark of God gets captured. And so that's the first big story that we see here at the beginning of chapter 4. From there, we go to verse 12, and we can see the death of Eli is talked about. Well, a Benjamite runs from this battle back to Shiloh. It would have been over 30 kilometers, so this is kind of one of those marathon stories where this guy, after fighting this battle, now is running back for 30 kilometers to go back to Shiloh to report the news. Eli was actually waiting by the side of the road, anxious to see what had happened to the Ark of the Covenant. And the messenger goes and tells the townspeople first the news, and a great outcry goes up. And Eli's wondering, what's going on? What's happening? The messenger then goes to Eli. Eli is 98 years old at this point and is blind. And the messenger delivers this very solemn message. He says, Eli, your 2 sons were killed, and the Ark of God was captured. Well, at that message that the Ark was captured, Eli actually falls backward off of his seat, breaks his neck, and dies. Then, if this is not enough, his daughter-in-law, which is Hophni's wife, who's pregnant at the time, hears the news that her husband and now father-in-law are both dead, that the Ark of the Lord has been captured, and she is so distressed, she actually goes into labor. And before dying, she names her baby and then expires. And the name that she pronounces is Ikavod, which we say in English, Ichabod, which means in Hebrew, no glory. She says, the glory of the Lord has departed from Israel. And that's kind of the end of that part of the story. It's Shakespearean, guys, when you actually look at these stories, these people that are dying, the drama that's taking place. It's crazy. Well, then we get to chapter 5. And here we see the ark, both in Ashdod and also in Ekron. I want to actually read chapter 5, verses 1 to 12 for you. It says, after the Philistines had captured the ark of God, and they took it from Ebenezer to Ashdod. Then they carried the ark into Dagon's temple and set it beside Dagon. When the people of Ashdod rose early the next day, there was Dagon fallen on his face on the ground before the ark of the Lord. They took Dagon and put him back in his place. But the following morning when they rose, there was Dagon fallen on his face on the ground before the ark of the Lord. His heads and hands had been broken off and were lying on the threshold. Only his body remained. This is why to this day neither the priests of Dagon nor any others who enter Dagon's temple at Ashdod step on the threshold. The Lord's hand was heavy upon the people of Ashdod and its vicinity. He brought devastation upon them and afflicted them with tumors. When the men of Ashdod saw what was happening, they said, the ark of the God of Israel must not stay here with us, because his hand is heavy upon us and upon Dagon our God. So they called together all of the rulers of the Philistines and asked them, what shall we do with the ark of the God of Israel? They answered, have the ark of God of Israel moved to Gath. And so they moved the ark of God. They moved the ark of the God of Israel. But after they had moved it, the Lord's hand was against that city, throwing it into great panic. He afflicted the people of the city, both young and old, with an outbreak of tumors. And so they sent the ark of God to Ekron. As the ark of God was entering Ekron, the people of Ekron cried out, they have brought the ark of God of Israel around to us to kill us and our people. And so they called together all of the rulers of the Philistines and said, send the ark of the God of Israel away. Let it go back to its own place, or it will kill us and our people. For death has filled the city with panic. God's hand was very heavy upon it. Those who did not die were afflicted with tumors, and the outcry of the city went up to heaven. And so again, a very powerful story. And this Ark of the Covenant is creating all kinds of havoc. First, they take it to Ashdod. Now, some would say, well, why would they choose the city of Ashdod? Well, that's because it was where the home of their temple was, the temple of their god Dagon. And you can see it here. They took it all the way down to Ashdod, further south in Philistia. Their god, Dagon, was the father of Baal, the chief god of the Philistines, who was all about grain and fertility. These were the big reasons why the Philistines celebrated him and worshipped him. Now, let me give you a little bit of insight here. What's going on when they take the Ark of the Covenant and they put it in Dagon's temple? Well, putting the Ark in Dagon's temple would have been like saying that Dagon was victor and that Yahweh was his prisoner. This is literally the message that is being sent here. Well, the Ark makes a mockery of Dagon. Literally makes a mockery. We see in day 1, Yahweh knocks Dagon over. He is on his face before the ark. It's almost like God positioned him so that he was on his face prostrate before, the Ark of the Covenant. They pick him up and put him back in his place when they see this, a little bit disturbed. And then on day 2, just to make sure that everyone was clear, Yahweh goes the next step. They find him the next day fallen again, but this time with his head and his arms broken off. And Yahweh then afflicts all of the people with tumors. The Septuagint in Latin Vulgate actually mentions that rats, death, and destruction accompanied these tumors as well. And the Septuagint specifies, that's the Greek translation of the Old Testament, it specifies that the tumors were actually in their groin area. Now, some would go, what kind of a weird detail is that to be included in the story? Well, if this is so, and again, it's not all translations that carry this, but it could be interpreted that Yahweh was actually making a mockery of their god Dagon, the fertility god, by putting these tumors in their groins. It's interesting. But the people have had enough, and they say, take this thing away, take it to the city of Gath. Now, little Bible quiz. Gath is down here, so they keep moving it around, as you can see. They take it to Gath. Anybody know somebody that was from Gath from your Sunday school classes? Anyone remember? Goliath, the giant, was from Gath. He was a Philistine, you will remember, that David defeated. We're going to get to that story later in our Crown series, but Goliath is from Gath. So they take it to Gath, and the same thing happens. More tumors break out in everybody. And so everybody starts playing hot potato with this Ark of the Covenant. They are passing that thing around like government plans for a nuclear plant. Like they just want to move it off, give it to the next town. We don't want it here. And so the ark starts wreaking havoc on everywhere that it is taken. They take it to Ekron, and again, the people by this time have heard of what's going on, and the word breaks out, and everyone's like, no, we don't want this thing here in our city. Are you trying to kill us? And as they take it there, already the ark starts wreaking havoc on the people of Ekron. They quickly decide that they only have one option left, and that is to send it back to Israel. These are great stories, eh? They're pretty incredible stories, and they really get our attention. Well, chapter 6, we have the story of the ark being returned to Israel. All told, it takes 7 months for the Philistines finally to send it back. And we're talking quite a bit of time. That's almost like the amount of time that we've been in this COVID thing so far. That's quite a bit of time to be afflicted by, this Ark of the Covenant and all of the illness that it brought with it. The Philistine priests and diviners decide that they should send it back, and not just to send it back, but send it back with a gift, they say, a guilt offering to Yahweh as they send it back. And so here's what they decide on. They say, what should we do as a gift? And someone says, well, we should make 5 of these tumors, fashion them out of gold, and then also 5 rats fashioned out of gold. Why? Well, to represent the tumors and the rats that they were being afflicted with, obviously. But then also, why 5? Because there were 5 major cities in Philistia and 5 major rulers at that time. So they decide to put them on the ark in a chest next to the Ark of the Covenant, these golden gifts, on a cart that's being pulled by 2 cows. And here's their logic. They say if the cows go to Beth Shemesh, which is the nearest Israelite city, then it was Yahweh indeed who had afflicted them. If it doesn't go there, if the cows don't lead there, then it wasn't even Yahweh in the first place. Well, they send the cows on their way, and they follow the cart from a distance. You can imagine them kind of following along just to see where it goes. And sure enough, it heads straight to Beth Shemesh. And the Israelites are out harvesting wheat, and they see the cart. And when they go to it and realize what it is, they start rejoicing. This is an amazing, amazing discovery. Some Levites immediately take the items off of the cart. They were the only ones allowed to do that. And then they go and break up the cart and make firewood out of it. They build a fire and they start a sacrifice, and they literally sacrifice the 2 cows that had pulled it there as an offering to Yahweh. Well, the 5 Philistine rulers, it says, were all watching from a distance and seeing what was taking place. It seems like a great story for the nation of Israel up until this point, but I want you to see what happens then in chapter 6, verse 19. Listen to what it says. But God struck down some of the men of Beth Shemesh, putting 70 of them to death because they had looked into the ark of the Lord. The people mourned because of the heavy blow the Lord had dealt them. And the men of Beth Shemesh said, who can stand in the presence of the Lord, this holy God? To whom will the ark go up from here? And so this is a very grim turn in this story. Some translations, in fact, more translations actually say that it wasn't 70 people that looked inside the ark and died as a result, but 50,070. And so this is like possibly a huge massacre that takes place as a result of this. Either way, what we're looking at is really, really heavy stuff. They aren't sure what to make of this Ark of the Covenant and of Yahweh, who is the power behind the Ark of the Covenant. Now, the Israelites, we know, they knew better. They understood the law. They knew full well that only the Levites were the ones that could handle the ark, and not even directly. They could, manipulate it around with poles and so on. But they understood clearly that looking into that box would have been a huge violation against Yahweh, an act of rebellion. If you check out Numbers chapter 4, you can see that. And the men of Kiriath Jearim, they come and get it next. And so you can see here, Beth Shemesh, and then it goes to Kiriath Jearim, and they take the Ark of the Covenant there. They take it to the house of Abinadab, and they have the wisdom to consecrate Abinadab's son so that he may actually be the guardian of the ark, and it ends up staying there for the next 20 years. Let's keep moving. The next story, Samuel subdues the Philistines at Mizpah. So the presence of the ark in Kiriath Jearim actually ends up having a purifying effect on that town. The people actually turn back to the Lord, it says in the beginning of this chapter. And Samuel challenges them to get rid of their Canaanite house gods, all of their Baals, and their Ashtaroths. And Samuel calls for a summit for all of the Israelites to meet in the city of Mizpah. And we can see that here. Mizpah's over here, just south of Bethel. He calls all of the Israelites there, and you can see that Samuel is actually acting like a judge now, just like in the book of Judges. He's acting like a judge for the people, more than just a spiritual leader. And so they did special offerings when they got there at Mizpah. They fasted as a nation together. But when the Philistines hear that all of the Israelites are gathered there in the one city of Mizpah, they decide this is a perfect time to attack. When the Israelites hear that they're on their way coming to attack them, the Israelites cry out to Samuel. And Samuel, you can just imagine, he's wondering, what do I do for the people here? He offers a lamb and sacrifices a lamb to the Lord and cries out to him on Israel's behalf. Well, the Lord hears his prayer, and he actually sends a great thunderstorm down upon the Philistines and throws them into this great panic. And the Israelites end up routing them that day in battle. Samuel then sets up a memorial stone. He names it Ebenezer, which is stone of help, as a way of commemorating the Lord's protection of them there that day. Well, this begins an era of peace and prosperity for the land of Israel. They regained some territories that the Philistines had taken from them. And Samuel, it says, then continues to serve as a circuit-riding judge amongst a number of Israelite towns, always returning back to his hometown in Ramah to see his family from time to time. Now, that's a lot of storytelling. I hope you were able to follow along with all of that. It's all there for you to go back and reread. You know, there is really just one underlying theme in all of these stories that I just read over these 4 chapters, and you must not miss the point that is being made here. So take note, here it is. The ark represents the glory of God, the unapproachable holiness and awesome power of God himself. Eli's daughter-in-law was seeing very clearly before her death, even though she was in great pain and about to expire. She connected the dots and she understood the significance of the Ark of the Covenant, that it represented the very kavod of God, the very glory of God. And once you understand this, guys, it becomes a cipher for all of the lessons, all of the stories that we see in this section of 1 Samuel. It's a key to unlock the meaning. Just so that you understand, you really can't separate God and his glory. God and his glory are intertwined. In fact, the NIV, the new NIV translation, actually translates his glory with a capital G, if you recognize it here. It's to say that his glory is personified. God and his glory are one and the same. And so the ark was designed to teach Israel and us something about the awesomeness of Yahweh. And so I want to dig into some lessons that we see. Once we unlock this truth, that this is all about the glory of God being represented by this ark of the covenant, this box, this container. Once we figure that out, there are some amazing lessons to pull out. Here's the first one. God's glory cannot be manipulated to our benefit. You know, the Israelites thought they could carry it into battle like a lucky charm, right? This reminds us of some of the things that we watch on Netflix where, you know, ancient civilizations would go into battle with certain relics or bones of saints or different things. And they thought that they could use it to their advantage. Now notice, if you look at the beginning of that chapter in chapter 4, they didn't spend any time, it would appear, praying or asking a prophet if they should even be going into battle in the first place. But now that things aren't going well, they think, well, this seems like a good idea. After they lost 4,000 men, they're like, let's just go and grab that Ark of the Covenant and bring it and see if that helps us do better next time. Guys, I hope that we have the wisdom to see ourselves in this story. How often do we as Christians treat God like he's our lucky charm? Guys, we do this all of the time. I'm not just talking about the Catholics that have their rosaries, that have their crucifixes. I'm talking about all of us. We all have our ways of doing this. I think about Christians who, if they don't say this out loud, they're thinking a lot of times, you know, if I have my quiet time today, if I read my Bible and pray, God will bless me. Almost like it's this cause and effect sort of lucky charm or magic 8-ball. You know, if I do this good deed, God will bless me. If I go to church this week, if I'm faithful going to church for the next couple months, you know, God will owe me something. You know, if I fast, right? If I really get serious with God and I fast, then God has to give me what I want. Guys, these are foolish thoughts, but a lot of Christians will think this way. Listen to me. God is not your lucky charm. He's not. And he wasn't beyond showing his people in a very hard way that he is not one to be trifled with or toyed with. Listen, guys, we try to use God this way sometimes. And I want you to understand, it is not beyond him to throw it in our face, just like he does with Israel here. And so make note of this. Listen up. We love and serve and obey and worship God because he is God, not for anything that we might get in return from him. And so we always have to come back to this. God's glory cannot be manipulated to our benefit. The second thing that we learn here is that God's glory is undiscriminating, unyielding, and actually overwhelming. And these words are all chosen, very strategically and specifically. It didn't matter if it was Israel or the Philistines. God wanted to make it really clear that he was awesome and terrifying to everyone. Everyone needed to get this message. It wasn't just one group or another, God's people or not the people of God. Guys, sometimes as Christians, we get the idea that God's justice, it doesn't really apply to us. We don't need to worry about God's justice, impacting us. Yes, we've been forgiven in Christ, and we are the benefactors of his grace. But you know what? The New Testament writers are very clear to remind us that we are not to take the grace of God in vain, and that our God, the writer of the book of Hebrews says, our God is a consuming fire. Guys, that should really make us sit up and take notice. Guys, God does not care about who you are. He doesn't care if you're a pastor or an imam or a Buddhist priest. He doesn't care if you're a factory worker or an elementary school teacher or student. He doesn't care if you're a politician or a MAGA hat wearing Trump lover. He doesn't care if you're a climate change denier or a militant environmentalist. He doesn't care if you're a gender fluid, two-spirited feminist or a cisgender atheist who's misogynistic to boot. He doesn't care who you are. He is your king, and he is the God of the universe. His power is terrifying, and his rules are unyielding, and his word is unbending, and you need to get a hold of that. All of us do. He is unmoved by our whining and our arrogance, and he is unimpressed by our intelligence. He is the God of the universe. And someday, when the celebrities that we have worshiped here on earth stand before him, do you know what? They're going to pee their pants as their knees knock together before his power and majesty. That is what's going to happen. And his glory will burn through them like a fire, and there will be nowhere for any of them to hide. This is the image that we are getting. Are you getting the picture that this Ark of the Covenant is trying to give to us today? God's glory is undiscriminating, it is unyielding, and it is overwhelming. The third big lesson that we see is that when God's glory departs, you are in trouble. You're in trouble when this glory leaves. As terrible as God's glory is, here's the deal, guys, you need it. You know what? The sun is very powerful as well. The sun will burn your skin, it will blind your eyes. But you need it. You need it. And the day that the sun stops shining on you is the day that your life is over. And it's a very great picture for what God is like. The day that God decides to pull away from any of us, guys, it is a terrible, terrible day. It is a day of doom for us. Again, we act so often like we control God, that God is at our beck and call, right? That somehow we call on God and he answers to us. But when people harden their heart toward God, whether it was back then in that day or whether it is today, the same thing is true. God will withdraw his glory from you, and it will be a dreadful day for you. Eli's daughter-in-law witnessed it, and she named her son Ichabod, the glory has departed. She saw with her own eyes the destruction that naturally happens when God withdraws his glory. Death and destruction follow. Guys, the God who holds the universe together, he also holds our lives together, the Bible says, and we need to be a lot more careful to not offend him. I saw a great meme this week. A lot of memes are kind of silly, but this was a really good one. It said, our society is careful not to offend anyone except God. And guys, that is so true of today. We're so careful not to offend anyone, but we don't even think about the God of the universe, and the fact that we may be offending him in so many of our decisions and the things that we do. When we worship money and success and popularity, it disgusts God. When we say, I'm going to live the way that I want to, I am playing a fool's game when I do that. Because for now, God makes his sun rise on the just and the unjust, the Bible says. The sun will rise and it will warm you. But Revelation 21:23 says that someday he is going to get rid of the sun. He's going to replace it with his own glorious self. And I want to ask you this morning, then where will the God rejectors be? Where will they be in that day? Then who will warm their backs and give light to their eyes when there's nothing left but the glory of God himself? Well, the fourth thing that we see here very clearly is that God's glory outshines all other glory. And that's the point in the story when we see the story of Dagon and how God really embarrasses this God and those who would follow him. The Philistines thought that Dagon was the one who made the wheat grow, who made their herds grow, who gave them children, and who built their nation. And they found out pretty quickly that it wasn't Dagon, but it was Yahweh who is the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. And guys, I want you to remember this morning, bring it, anew to your minds, that it is God's glory that outshines all other glory. We as human beings, we make music, but God, he makes thunder and lightning and rain. We make houses, but God makes mountains. We make light bulbs, but God makes galaxies. And his glory is bigger than anything that we can imagine. And he alone deserves our worship. The fifth big lesson that we can pull out of this is that God's glory weighs heavily on his enemies. You do not want to be an enemy of God facing down his incredible glory. When the Philistines take the ark, they end up bringing a world of hurt upon themselves. They failed to appropriate the power and the glory of Yahweh. And guys, the same is true today. When people live in disregard of God's glory, it always brings them harm. It always brings them harm. When you ignore God's glorious design for the family, you bring harm into your life. When you ignore God's glorious plan for sexuality, you bring harm into your life. When you ignore God's glorious compassion that he has for the poor, you bring harm into your life. When you mistreat God's glorious creation, you bring harm into your life. And when you ignore God as the glorious creator of the universe, you will suffer for it if you do not acknowledge his greatness and his glory. How badly our nation needs to rediscover the glory of God. Our nation is ignorant of it today. But just as we see in the story of the Philistines, you know what? Ignorance is no excuse for the law. And our own legal system backs that up. Ignorance is not an excuse for the law. And like the law, the Philistines discovered that God is unyielding when it comes to his glory. The sixth lesson is that God's glory needs to be respected by his own people too. When the ark came back to Israel, to Beth Shemesh, the Israelites were so happy, they were so excited, but they ignored the laws that they knew very well regarding the ark. Guys, sometimes we as Christians today, we're like this. We forget about the fact. We look at everybody else and the things that they may be doing wrong, the things that, God would want to judge them for, but we forget that we are doing so many things wrong ourselves. They ignored the laws regarding the ark, and the lesson there is that the people of God are not off the hook. In fact, if anything, we are more responsible for honoring the glory of God than anyone else. God expects us to honor him more than anyone would honor him. Guys, let me ask you, how are you going to respect the glory of God this week? How are you going to do that? Are you going to do it by what you worship? Are you going to do it by what you fill your mind with this week, or what you say no to? Are you going to do it by what you chase after, what you give honor to? Guys, we are always demonstrating whether or not we give honor to the glory of God or not by the way that we live our lives. And when we look for glory in other things other than God, our lives always become miserable. It is always destructive for us. The last lesson I want to give you is this. It says, when we honor God's glory properly, it brings protection and success. And that's the lesson from chapter 7. when the ark is taken to Kiriath Jearim. When the people gave the ark its proper honor, what we see here is that they flourished. The people thrived. God protected them from their enemies, and they prospered. Now, this is not to say that the people of God will never face hardship as they're giving God glory, but it does say that the general pattern is that our lives will be so much better when we give God his due glory. Well, I hope we've learned something about the glory of God this morning. I want to end this morning with one last little bit of information that I think you'll find very intriguing and useful. Have you ever thought about the contents of the Ark of the Covenant? We know that it was this container overlaid with gold with the cherubim on top of it. It's a powerful picture when you actually look inside this ark and see what was actually there and what they represent. First of all, the 10 Commandments were there. That represents God's law, of course. We're very clear on that. And you know the story about how God took Moses up into the mountain, that the people couldn't even touch the mountain because it was burning with fire and smoke, and it was terrifying. But God there was giving his law. And the 10 Commandments are in this box. This pot of manna is also in the box. And manna, we know, was this provision that God gave to the Israelites, a provision that they scorned, a provision that they were not thankful for. Even though it was very nourishing and it came from heaven and it fed them every day, they complained about it. Well, it represents God's often underappreciated provision, this manna. But then there's the third one, and that's Aaron's staff, this rod that he had. And we may need a little refresher on what that was all about. In our Jude series, I talked about Korah's rebellion. If you remember, you can go back and check that message out. But Moses followed God's severe law and actually put a Sabbath breaker to death at one point in Israel's history. And then Korah, who was one of the Levites, actually rallied 250 leaders against Moses and Aaron as a result. He felt that was way too harsh. God should not have told you that, and if God told you that, you should not have acted upon that, Moses. That is not good leadership. Moses was just following what God told him to do. And so a whole showdown was planned where God would put fire in the censers of the leaders that he approved of and who he considered to be right. And in Numbers chapter 16, look at what it says. It says, when Korah had gathered all of his followers in opposition to them at the entrance to the tent of meeting, the glory of the Lord appeared to the entire assembly. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron, guys, separate yourselves from this assembly so that I can put an end to them at once. God was not impressed with these leaders or their rebellion. They thought that they knew more than God. They thought that their ways were better than God's ways, or that God didn't understand the full situation. And God actually opened up the earth and swallowed up Korah and everyone that was associated with him, the text says. The next day, the story that you may not be familiar with, that we didn't cover in the book of Jude, was that God took things one step further. He actually asked every tribe leader to bring their staff with their name inscribed on it, and Aaron's name was going to go on the staff of the Levites. And the staff of the man who was God's chosen leader, God said would actually have buds on it the next day. And so they did as God asked, and the next day when they went and looked at the different staffs of the 12 different leaders, they saw that only the staff of Aaron had budded. And not only had it budded, it had blossomed, and it had actually borne almonds on it. God wanted to make a very clear statement that Aaron was his chosen leader and the leader of the Levites. Numbers chapter 17, the Lord said to Moses, put back Aaron's staff in front of the Ark of the Covenant law to be kept as a sign to the rebellious. And so, guys, are you seeing the picture here of this third element in the ark? What can we learn from these contents that God had them put into this holy container? Well, here's the application, guys. We honor God's glory when we uphold his law, are thankful for his provision, and submit to his leadership. Guys, there is so much good stuff in these pages as we go through this series, The Crown. I hope that you will dig deep into it this week and really take the time to reflect on it even more.